Well, welcome back. This is Two Beards and a Bible. I'm John Swaino.
I'm Dave Tenney.
And we are in Matthew chapter 23 today, and we're continuing. If you've been following along with us, we're kind of picking up where we left off. So, Matthew chapter 23, and we're just going to start at verse 1 and read for a little while, and we'll stop and we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
And we'll, as Dave was just mentioning before we started the recording, that this is not an easily divided up bit of scripture, so we'll just read until something strikes us that we want to speak on. So, starting at chapter 23, verse 1, then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. So we'll stop there for just a second.
You ever work in a phylactery?
No. I've heard it's rough, though. So yeah, the phylacteries, that's the edges, the borders of their garments, and, just to be showy.
Yeah.
I think of, whether or not it's the proper example of a phylactery, but I think of the time when I was growing up and my parents attended a Methodist church, and the preacher would wear this big scarf thing around their neck.
Oh, yeah.
And, it would change colors from time to time, but it was shiny and ornate, sometimes embroidered with an ornate embroidery and so on. And I just can't help but think about that. She it was a woman preacher for a period of time. But any of those preachers, they would wear a robe, and wear special garments to get up and preach.
If you ever saw one of my wedding pictures, because we got married by a Methodist preacher.
Oh, okay.
And he had some big purple doodad on.
Right.
One of them things on, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, behind us here, there's a closet on the other side of this wall, and I have the acolyte sticks. I don't know what you call them, but I was an acolyte when I was a little kid. It was the little things that had a little candle coming out of them.
Oh,
light
the
candles,
yeah,
and so on. But I kept those when that particular church building was sold. And that particular church closed up. I was able to keep those. Still have them as a memento, I suppose.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, that's what I think of with phylacteries and thinking of verse 3 there. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, that's like the worst way to parent.
Son, don't drink.
Right. I have, just in my short lifetime, I have seen that explode. In families with parents that did those things, but nonetheless, and by that it's hard for a person to do that. It's hard to live in a situation where you're being told one thing and you're seeing another.
I have a friend that I've known for years, and we were talking about this sort of thing, and he was just kind of lamenting the fact that, he does things that he wishes he didn't do. And then his kids get mad at him for doing those things. And, this idea is you have to be a good parent, especially a good father, you have to be a good example.
Yeah.
Which means that you can't ask them to do something that you're not doing.
Right. Yeah, and that's going to come up as you're raising children. That's going to come up from time to time. Your children will, very honestly point out, well, should you be doing that? And maybe you haven't been thinking about it, and you think, well, you're right, I shouldn't.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful time it's a teaching moment.
Yep.
Because your kids are watching, what are you going to do with that? When you're presented with the truth, what do you do? And the same thing, as we look out on the religious world, in many cases, a lot of the things that we hear coming out of some of the religious places, because it's coming from the scriptures, we can listen to those things and do them. But just like we read here, we see a lot of religious bodies binding heavy burdens hard to bear on men's shoulders, but they themselves don't do it.
Absolutely. And you see that all the time.
And this is where so many people get the idea that, well, I'm just going to give up on the Lord and on church because it's just full of hypocrites.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. When you see a person who's a quote unquote religious leader,
Right.
and then they get involved, and my mind always goes to Jim and Tammy Lee Baker, back in the '80s, but Jerry Falwell, these people that are supposed to be religious leaders, then you find out, oh, these people are, man, they're not real, they're terrible people.
I have a hard time with a lot of those because they're as phony as the day is long.
Oh,
I mean, you can see them from 10 miles away, yet so many people fell for it. I don't understand.
And still
that.
fall for it.
Yeah.
But those people, they talk about one thing and they do a different thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's been to the detriment of Christ.
Yeah. And even though, when you look at all of the different religious bodies where this has happened, and even though they are not the Lord's church, even though they do not resemble something that you can find in scriptures, you're right. It is to the detriment of the Lord's church because people
they associate that with religion.
Yeah. It comes from that whole idea of worship the way that you want to, or attend the church of your choice.
Yeah, don't do that. Attend the church that closely matches the Bible.
Attend the church that Christ died for.
Yes.
And you'll find it. You might have to drive a little extra.
Yeah.
You might have to drive 40 minutes to an hour. Yeah. I know of places where people drive multiple hours to a different state to be able to go to services at the Lord's church.
Yeah.
I mean, it might take that sacrifice. Maybe you want to move closer.
Yeah.
I mean, and those sound like huge hurdles.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you put the Lord first, you got nothing to worry about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, what is it, Ephesians 4:4, it talks about the one body. It doesn't talk about multiple bodies,
Right.
So, I mean, it's, those ideas,
Yeah.
are all wrapped up in kind of some of the things we're saying. But getting back to our scripture here, so, these people, they bind these heavy burdens, and then he says, but all their works they do to be seen by men. And that's why he talks about, they make their phylacteries or their garments. I've also heard that phylactery referred to as like a leather pouch or a leather box that they would carry pieces of the scripture on.
No.
And they would wear those, like on their forehead and different things. So there's, there's all kinds of, but it doesn't, that in that definition, it doesn't make sense that they would be broad.
Right.
So,
right.
But, they make, and I guess the phylacteries that they would wear their clothing would have like maybe some scriptures written on them or something.
Right.
But they did all these things so they would look like they were just the most super righteous.
Yeah.
But they weren't at all. But they did these things not because they were righteous, but they wanted to be seen as righteous. And there's a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there's that stuff, as human beings, we tend to, we're drawn to the shiny stuff.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Of religion. If you go to Europe and you go into some of the churches and you see how much gold inlay there is, and
you've been into some of them churches.
Yeah, and the ornate artwork, and if you see the Pope and the pointy hat that he wears,
Yeah.
you know, it's that's exactly. I mean, you can't help but think of those things when you read this. If you read it honestly, I mean, that's what it's talking about.
No doubt. He says they love the best places at feasts, the best seats in synagogues, greetings in the marketplace, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they just love this elevated place in society
Right.
that they get from looking like they're righteous.
Yeah.
But yet they're not.
Yeah. You know, being a preacher, sometimes people will call you reverend. And it just kind of makes your skin crawl a little bit. It makes my skin crawl a little bit when people do that. But we see that there's all kinds of that kind of thing going on where people get the best seats. And you think of let's just use the Pope as an example.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's the words I think that I've heard used that he's the vicar of Christ. You know, he's the representative of Christ here on earth. And so let's just go there. Did Christ put himself in the best places?
No.
Did Christ wear those fancy garments? So let's go to Rome. Let's go to Vatican City and try to go in and talk to the Pope. You and I just walk in there.
Yeah.
You think we're going to be allowed to?
No.
You think we're going to be able to get within 10 feet of him? You know,
maybe not even more than 100 feet of him.
Right. You know, so that's that's not what we see in Christ.
No.
You know, he was dealing with people that were not looked upon fondly by society, and he wasn't wearing broad phylacteries and garments with enlarged borders.
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read on through. So verse 8 he says, but you, he says, do not be called a rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father. Speaks of what you were just saying.
Mm-hmm.
For one is your father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. That he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So we'll stop there. So you know, this idea that that rather than be like these Pharisees and have these the broad factories on, right, and try to get the best things and want people to call them rabbi, he says, don't be like that. He goes, you know, don't. I like where he says, don't be called rabbi, which means teacher.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, for one is your teacher. So that's not a title that we should wear.
Right.
You know, and I sometimes I refer to myself, you know, as you know, oh, I'm a Bible class teacher.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about this, I'm like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't say that. I don't know.
Right.
but yeah, I mean, we see this attitude, and I really think that's what this is all about.
Yeah.
Do not call anyone on earth your father.
Yeah. I think of, you know, there are those that I've known that were the leader or so of some religious body, and they want to always be referred to as Dr. Reverend, you know, and yeah, I don't, that's it's right here.
Yeah.
You know, why would you puff yourself up that way?
I used to work with this guy, and he'd go, "I can't truck with that." Right. So yeah, so he's just basically telling us that, you know, that we should be humble and we should be servants. And if you think about Jesus and how he lived, that's the example he gave to us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Verse 11 is where you left
13.
off? 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation.
Okay, so the one thing I underlined this because I thought this was an interesting thought. He says that you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in.
Yeah.
And, the idea of that they didn't believe. They rejected Christ. And then they led, so they weren't going in, and then they led others to the pathway of destruction.
Yeah. And really they do prevent people from entering in because they speak so against the truth.
Yeah.
And in some cases, I remember somebody who had left the Catholic Church, and the priest wrote them a letter and said, "You're leaving the Holy Catholic Church, and you're going to hell." In no uncertain terms, and that has great sway over a lot of people.
Yeah, it does.
The words of somebody that they've come to revere and know. It was hard for those people, even though they had left that behind. Those were stinging words.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And it's hard to get that when you've been raised with that. It's hard to get that out of your mind and out of you, and to really just very simply just follow the scriptures and not men.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you personally, there's still like denominational teachings that I struggle with today.
Mm-hmm.
They like because you were brought up with them. They affect you in a deep way.
Yeah.
Things you were taught when you were a little kid. You have to like unlearn that stuff.
Yeah, and I have tried to remember this for years and I have failed. But going back to my time in studying psychology, I remember in college being taught, and there's a term that I can't remember that explains this, or at least that has been named, but the things that you learn first in your life, they hold precedent over the things that you learn after. It's so hard to get those things out once you learn them. And that's, again, why we even read in the scriptures to bring up a child
in the way that he should go.
Exactly. From a young age, and he will not depart. And that's very true. If you start a child out in the church and they come to know these things, they're unlikely to fall away.
I guess Anderson, your son, and Charlie, my son, Charlie tells me that they were going to do Two Boys in the Bible tonight.
Oh, okay.
That's what they were going to call it.
Okay.
I said, okay. Him and I were kind of talking about that today. So
we've got
this next generation, working on it.
There you go.
So I said, well, what are you going to study? He said, I don't know. Anderson's supposed to handle that. I said, well, next time you ought to find out.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's moving on here to verse 14. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. What do you take of that one?
Well, I mean, so the part where they devour widows' houses, it sounds like they are in some way figuring a way to cheat people out of money when they're supposed to be taking care of those people.
Yeah.
And then they would make long prayers. And I always think about the the tax collector and the Pharisee that are praying in the temple.
Yeah.
And the Pharisee's like, oh, God, I thank you that I'm not like this terrible person over here. And the other guy's saying, God, forgive me, I'm a sinner. That's kind of what I think he's getting at, that same thing. They make long prayers. And this is something like today, even today, sometimes you will see somebody who will get up and make a prayer and they preach a sermon.
Yes.
They're not praying to God, they're preaching a sermon.
Yeah.
And that actually drives me crazy.
Yeah.
Especially when I'm like, there's people in here that are 90. You can't make them stand this long. They're dropping like flies back there.
So they're for pretense. You know, it's really, you know, and I've seen people that will stand up in the middle of the Golden Corral and hold a prayer for their table, but they'll do it in such a way that everybody hears them. You know, and that speaks to this, what we see here, and the preaching of a. That's the preaching of a re-preaching the sermon.
Yes, exactly.
That's
yeah.
Yep.
So verse 15 it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he has won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." So they were evangelistic, right?
Yeah.
You know, they would do that, but then they would lead them totally down the wrong path.
And we have how many institutions of higher learning that are attached to denominations, churches.
Oh yeah.
And you know, they put a lot of effort into winning people over.
Yeah.
To their way, and in the end, they come out corrupted.
Yeah.
You know, I remember I went to a college that professed Christ. You know, right on the sign they professed Christ. It was a quote unquote Christian college, and I remember in my sophomore year, I remember taking a Bible class, and we had a professor that was new. He was fresh out of the military, retired Air Force, I think, and he came in and he was as he taught. I got to thinking, you know, this guy's not like the others.
Yeah.
He's pretty spot on a lot of these things, you know, because I was learning back then, and I was being introduced to the church, and so there were things that I heard from the other entrenched professors that were just way off, and this guy wasn't. Well, years and years later, you know, got to hear some things, some of his lessons and so on later, and realized that now he's becoming more entrenched.
Yeah.
You know, and it happens, and I guess maybe it's on subject, maybe I've gone off subject, but the when you're going to send your children to a place of higher learning, just because they profess Christ on the sign,
that don't mean a thing.
In fact, that's probably a red flag. You know, because it is the church.
Yeah.
Has the authority to teach.
Yeah.
You know, and individual Christians having the authority to teach and build up one another, but there's a red flag when we have.
Yeah, I mean, God put an institution together to teach Christians how to be Christians, and even how to be preachers.
Yeah.
And I know you could say this as well as I can, but you know, I've been helped along the way by other Christians. Yeah. I've been helped by John.
Yeah, likewise here.
You know, it's you learn as you go along. You don't necessarily need to go to college to learn the Bible.
It's an internship.
It is. It is.
rather than a
formal.
A formal education.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he talks about verse 16. You want to read it?
Yep. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, "Whoever swears by the temple is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it, and by all things on it."
Keep reading to 22.
Verse 21, "He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it."
The only thing I can say, I've read this, but as I started reading of this, I thought about Matthew chapter 5 and verse 34, where Jesus talks about swearing, and I'm not talking about saying things you ought not to say. You got that, John?
But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black.
Let your yes be yes and your no be no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. Mm-hmm. So the only thing I can say is, as I read this, I thought about that, and the Pharisees must have had this whole system of swearing by different things.
Right.
And they were teaching all of these like bizarre things that were not in alignment with God's will.
Right.
And
it kind of speaks to, this having putting value on stuff. We see
yes.
We see it in a lot of religious bodies now, where you have, sacred things and sacred this and sacred that, and even the bones of people that have passed away that are sacred. The whole deal with swearing to the gold. Swearing to the temple, it is nothing but whoever swears to the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. That just speaks to their earthly, greedy minds.
Yeah, they're putting the gold as more valuable.
Yeah.
He's just speaking to what they're, and really when we go back and we think about Matthew chapter 5, where he says, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." I mean, why would you need to swear on all of these things?
Yeah.
If you're just going to tell the truth all the time,
right?
No reason to swear on anything.
And again, if you are in Christ, if you're seeking after Him and you love the Lord, why would you do anything else?
Right.
Why do you need?
Yeah.
Why do you need something to swear upon?
What about going to court, John? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth? Would you do that, John?
No, I wouldn't. I would affirm that I'm going to tell you the truth.
Yeah, that's what I would do too.
Yeah.
I wouldn't swear to tell the truth on a stack of Bibles.
Right.
I just swear to tell the truth.
Right.
But that's what I think that's a modern, which is almost laughable today in court, because how many people actually revere the Bible?
Right. Yeah, I don't even know if it's probably been taken out of a lot of.
Probably.
Because they've taken any
religious.
Yeah, any kind of inscription on the buildings or a statue out front or anything that has anything to do with religion out of it.
Verse 23 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides, you who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel."
That paints a picture.
Oh, it does.
Yeah, and that, the paying tithes of mint, anise, and cumin, that's check boxes.
Yes.
But they're not doing anything, they're not producing any fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, they're worried about these little laws that they've come up with.
Yeah.
And they've neglected the rest of the law. What about 25 on for a little ways?
"Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also."
My dad had a neighbor.
Uh-huh.
And he brought him a plate of food one time. This is a story. My dad's gone, but he goes, I ate that plate of food, and he goes, and I went to wash the dish, and he goes, they never washed the back of that dish. He goes, it was filthy. He goes, I got sick after I ate that. But he's talking here, he says, about cleansing the outside of the cup. You cleanse you're worried about outside appearances, but your insides are terrible.
Yeah, and that's that has so many applications to the things that we see going wrong today.
Yeah.
Murder, stealing, all of the sins that you can imagine, they really come from people not cleaning the inside of the cup.
Yeah. Yeah.
If people just trusted in the Lord and put this word into their hearts and purged out all the stuff that is in there from the world and from from sin, the outside would become clean.
Yeah.
It's
I heard on the news today that the drug cartels in Mexico are trying to help the U.S. government stop all this human trafficking. And I gotta say, when the drug cartels are saying, this isn't right, we're in a bad spot.
honor among thieves.
Yeah.
The same thing. The same thing happened if you study the Cosa Nostra, the mob. They had a code of ethics.
Yeah.
Even them. And it's strange. It's strange that we see these things, but if we just follow the word,
Yes.
it'll all fall into place.
Yep. Let's try to read through. I'm going to read through 36. We'll just read right through it, and so we can finish this up. He says, "What are you, scribes and Pharisees? For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead man bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore you are witnesses against yourselves, that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, if I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes, some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temples and the altar. Surely I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." So I think he just comments more about their outward, that the outward are like trying to look like they're perfect.
Yeah.
And they look back through their history and say, oh, we wouldn't have done what our forefathers did. But Jesus is pointing out that you will do those things. Yeah. And as we read the New Testament, we find out that they did do those things.
Yeah. 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 Brood of vipers, the language that we see again. And that paints a picture.
Yeah.
Serpents. And what the first time we hear of a serpent back
in the
Genesis,
garden. Yeah. In the
it's
garden
not a good thing.
No. No, absolutely not. Well, John, we better wrap it up here.
Yeah. Wow, we're like 2 minutes over.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining in. This has been Two Beards and a Bible. We will hopefully see you next time. Like, subscribe, share, tell your friends. And if you have any questions, you'd like to study more with us, we'd be glad to do that.
Yep,
so,
absolutely.
Please do let us know.
Yep.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Come on.